Let me ask you this. Who do you think is the most underrated guitar player of all time? Like, who's the first guy that comes to your mind when you think, dang, that person never got the credit that they deserved in their time, and it's absolutely egregious? You see, for me to answer that question, we have to go all the way back to college when I was first learning to play the electric guitar, because I was obsessed with one thing. That thing is called shredding. I wanted to play as fast as humanly possible. I wanted to master those 5 pentatonic notes and play them so fast that anyone who even entered the room would say, dang, that guy right there, he plays faster than I ever could. And upon looking into that style of playing, I wanted to know who are the guys that could influence me and who are the greats in this area. And among looking up the great shredders, I noticed that a lot of the great guitar players who had really made a name for themselves were actually guys who were pretty restrained with a lot of their speed, right? Guys like Eric Clapton, B.B. King, Freddie King, Albert King, Martin Luther King. Wait. One of those isn't right. And I started to notice that even though a lot of those guys had really complicated licks, sometimes even faster licks than I often give them credit for, they all had one special, specific thing in common. It's this thing called feel. And feel is a weird term for us guitar players because it's something that's really hard to quantize, right? And a lot of the times, especially with those great players, it becomes even more than just the note choices and the way you play them. It goes down to even the touch of the guitar. And upon really analyzing the feel of those guys that I just listed, one of them that really stuck out to me was Mr. Eric Clapton. You see, this guy had had decades upon decades of just legendary licks that guitar players had endlessly tried to copy and craft their styles after. And one lick in particular that stood out to me sounded kind of like this. Try to see if you recognize it. So let me ask you, do you recognize that? It's called Old Love, and I was instantly obsessed with it. And it's not just the lyrical content, because I am a sucker, like a literal sap for like bad old relationships from a good guitar player, but I started to really get into that song from Clapton. I wanted to know how the solos went, how the intros went. So I ended up really getting into the live performances, and while Clapton was wearing a very sick green and purple suit combination, I noticed that one of his guitar players on the side, a guy wielding a silver Strat, actually took one of the solos in the song, and I'm like, okay, you're not just any guitar player if Clapton's letting you take a solo on one of his best songs. And I noticed that during his solo, his phrasing was impeccable. I mean, this dude was next level. I really hadn't seen soloing like that before, right? His bends were some of the most expressive that I had heard. It was like this weird combination of like the natural tone of like a Jimmy Vaughn with like B.B. King's phrasing. I was like literally floored by what I was hearing. I had to know more about this guy. I had to do more research. And it turns out he was actually one of the writers on the song, and his name... And I was like, why haven't I heard of this guy before? He's so good. And he had had that solo performance that I talked about where he'd done all those expressive bends, so I knew it was time to really do my research on this player. And I found that he'd had a very successful solo career, and just as a guitarist, he had played the Crossroads Festival, he played with B.B. Clapton. They all recognized him as one of the greats. In fact, in one of his Crossroads Festival intros for his song Time Takes Two, John Mayer ended up saying about him, "Great music that is not in the mainstream needs a host, someone that brings you into the fold. That's Jimi Hendrix, that's Stevie Ray Vaughan, that's Robert Cray." And I was instantly like, whoa, this guy is so good that one of the best players on the planet is willing to put him in the same likes as Jimi Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan? Like the legends of legends? What is it? And I actually found my answer in a very weird place. I found my answer right next door. Mike, what do you mean right next door? Well, you see, one of Robert Cray's best songs is called Right Next Door. If you do any sort of research on his career, that's one of the first singles that'll come up. And one of the things that I notice is he does this super funky rhythm part in the verses. And I was like, that's really cool, because that kind of emulates like a lot of Nile Rodgers and a lot of like funky stuff like Al McKay from the 70s. So he kind of has this versatility in his playing style in not just doing like a straight 12-bar blues and sort of varying it up his styles. But then the cool part was when he got to the solo. Like I said before, I noticed in Old Love that this dude was just different in the way that he solos. And it brought me back to one of the core concepts that I remember really learning as a guitar player. What makes not just a great solo, but a great piece of music is the call and response. And as soon as this solo starts, you can tell this guy's mastered it. You get your call and your response. See, that's not even the coolest part. What I started to notice is that a lot of blues players really focus on targeting notes. And I noticed that he really likes motifs and he really likes repeating licks, specifically in this solo. That's what really put my ear in the loop and started to find out why I found it fascinating, because he's not afraid to repeat licks and really make things memorable while still doing that call and response, because immediately in the solo he hits, then do the same thing in a different octave, before going to another motif and making the BB King box just sing. And again, Homeboy is doing all of this while using minimal effects. He's very old school in that way. You look up all of his equipment and all you can really find is amp, guitar, and very minimal pedals. And just seeing the inner workings of like the harmony and the actual melodies behind his songs, that was one thing. But then it became about seeing why I hadn't really found this man beforehand. I wanted to know where he was amongst the greats. So I did what I usually did at the time, and I looked up Rolling Stone's list of 100 greatest guitar players of all time. A very controversial list among the community for very good reasons at points. And I saw that it wasn't even just about where he was placed on the list. He wasn't even on the list. And I know they did one variation of that, so then I looked again, and he wasn't on that list. Then I looked at Vintage Guitar's 100 greatest guitarists of all time, and he wasn't on that list either. And I began to notice and formalize my hypothesis, as my high school science teacher would say, and I was like, oh, this man really is one of the most underappreciated guitar players of all time. He's played with all of the blues greats. Every time there's a Crossroads Festival mashup of Every Day I Have the Blues or some other great blues songs, there's always Clapton, there's always BB, sometimes there's Jimmy Vaughn, and he's always right there next to them, always soloing, always bringing the same amount of energy and the same amount of great licks. There's just a respect of Robert Cray amongst the great guitar players. And I'm like, he should be mentioned with all of those greats. So one of the biggest compliments that I think when it comes to all-time greats and just respect on influences that they have in our generation is when you go to a guitar store, like specifically start playing with somebody and they say, oh man, you play a lot like Jimi Hendrix, or, oh man, you've listened to a lot of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I just wish that a lot more people, maybe I need to start doing this or start noticing more, just saying, man, you play a lot like Robert Cray, if I notice it. Or maybe just more people need to play like Robert Cray because he's that good and he has that much influence. I got told once at a gig, no joke, that I look like a young Robert Cray. I don't know if I really see it, but if I could learn to play a little bit more like him and learn to use some of those like staccato, feel-infused 80s blues licks, I think you play like Robert Cray would be one of the best guitar compliments that I could ever get. But I think that's going to take a lot of practice. And I think it's one of those things where it's important to really capture some of those players, to really think about the players who we think are underrated. Just being like a John Mayer fanboy myself, I get caught up, really stuck on one or two guitar players and just only stealing licks for them. And I had a guitar teacher and a very good friend one time just tell me straight up, who else are you listening to other than Mayer? Mayer is incredible. He's one of the best players of all time, but like, who else are you stealing licks from? Because even he didn't just learn from one player. Jimi Hendrix didn't just learn from one player. Stevie Ray Vaughan didn't just learn from one player. Who are you getting by with? Because creating a sound comes from a community of influences, and finding those underrated guys, finding those gems is what's going to make you really stick out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Super fun to review Robert Cray. Make sure to like and subscribe if you had a good time. Check out the links in the description. Really helps the channel. And most important of all, have a fantastic day. She was just another notch on my guitar.